Okay, so it's finally time. We've compiled all our information that we already know, and we're actually going to start diving in and doing some more creative stuff. And this is the first update of kind of the series. Keep sending in the recommendations, and I'll keep updating and adding for whatever y'all want, whatever y'all want to see. Cool. So, like I said, we're working several programs. First, what are we doing here? Well, we're creating a CGI scene. So, what does that entail? Um, this is more visual effects, I would say, as well. CGI is completely computer generated. This is a mixture, so we're going to be doing a lot of compositing and stuff. So for compositing CGI, there's several steps. First, we need to prepare the footage, which is the footage you see right now. And then we're going to set the scene in Cinema 4D and Octane, and that's where the actual CGI work is going to be done. We're going to set our scene up to the footage, match all the perspectives, match the placement of the CGI items, match the lighting, and then we're going to turn the footage off in the background and render out just the CGI. Cool. And then after that, we're going to take the CGI footage and the raw footage, so our just CGI stuff and just our raw stuff, go into After Effects and start compositing them together. And the reason we don't render them out together inside of Cinema 4D is because our CGI footage is in log, and then our Cinema 4D and Octane footage is in raw linear. So there's just a you don't those colors won't match up. So our whole goal inside of After Effects is to match up those colors, and then add some more elements like distortions, blurriness, noise to fully match those two together, along with matching the color. And then finally, we're going to be finished, export it out, and then we can send it to the coloring team. And I will say, if you are working with a coloring team, you just need to know they're probably going to ask for several revisions. So what I like to do is, if you have a clip like this, I would actually separate the CGI and the background, and that kind of makes the coloring job a little bit better, and then they can just alpha blend them transparently. Cool, so let's get started with preparing the footage. So for this particular footage, it's nothing crazy. I'm literally just laying here on the ground and the camera is not moving. So the reason we shot it this way was several. We're going to be working with some 2D elements, and it's going to be able to save us a bunch of time in rendering. So I did not want the camera to move for this. We actually kind of just added a fake shake in post, if you can see right there, and it sold it good enough, especially with the lens flare. So I'm happy with it, and this was kind of like a one-take thing. We weren't going to be able to go out here and shoot this again, so I really wanted it to be foolproof. And the reason is, if your camera is moving, that's fine. You're just gonna have to do some 3D tracking, and that can sometimes be a little bit difficult. This scene's pretty clean, but you can still see there's quite a bit amount of noise in it as I scrub through. I hope that's coming through the YouTube compression. What you'd want to do is go ahead and clean all of that up if you're going to be 3D tracking. And I'd recommend using DaVinci Resolve. That's what I'm using. You just go in here, go here, and then go to temporal noise 1, spatial threshold. This is where you're going to zoom in, luma and chroma. Just drag that up, go to enhance, and there you go. You can also detach them. It doesn't look like we have that much chroma noise, but we have quite a bit of luma noise. And we just drag these up just to clean it up. And now it's a lot less noisy. Still pretty noisy though. There's also this temporal threshold, luma, and chroma. We can crank that up as well. And that just kind of cleans it up and makes it easier to go and use. There's a lot of 3D tracking is a whole art form in of itself, so I didn't want to get into that with this lesson. But there's a lot to you can mess up essentially. You want to make sure your camera, you have your sensor size of your camera, your focal length of your camera. You have if the camera has lens distortions, you're going to want to fix that. So if we go here, and guys, if your footage is not moving, if you did it on a tripod, you don't have to worry about this, but I'll just show y'all. If you have lens distortions, you're actually going to want to bring a line in and then fix these distortions and perspectives of the lens and try to get that right. But we don't have any of those issues. We're just really preparing our footage. So let's go ahead and go export. Let's say you got your footage there. You just set an in point. So we're going to type I and an out point. This can be done in Premiere, After Effects. You can do this in After Effects for sure. Also, Final Cut could do this as well. We are just using DaVinci Resolve because it is my favorite linear editor, or non-linear editor. Yes, that's what they're called. Cool. So we got our piece right here, and it's always good to grab too much of this because you never know like how long you want your scene to actually be. I've already done this though, so I'm just going to grab this right here. This is the important part. Octane, we can actually import image textures, which you know that by now, but we can also import them as sequences. So I like to do TIFFs 16-bit, and then we set our resolution. Frame rate, this is really, really important. you want to make sure you have your rate matched up exactly. This was shot at off-speed frame rate 24 frames a second, so it's going to be that. If your frame rate is not matched up exactly, you will get some issues. So you need to make sure, and this is why I love DaVinci Resolve as well. Look, frame rate, it tells us right here. If you don't know this, this was exactly 24 frames a second, which I knew that because I was working with the cinematographer and made sure that we were mapping exactly 24. We'll talk about that a little bit when we jump into Cinema 4D, why that's so important. So we're going to export an image sequence. So we're going to do TIFFs, RGB 16-bit, file, and then we want to use, I always go down to 1, and then make sure everything looks right. Each clip starts at frame 0. I like to do that as well. That's just the best way that when you're working with Octane, it's going to start at frame 0. Cinema 4D is going to start at frame 0. You want your footage to start at frame 0, or else you're going to get some mistakes, especially if your camera is moving. This is not so much of a big deal if your camera is not moving. Just know that it will cause problems down the line if your camera is moving for sure. And then add a name, add to render queue, and then export, and I'll see you on Cinema 4D. Okay, so now we are inside of Cinema 4D. We have our live viewer window up and just docked right here in the corner. I'm just going to undock that so it has a little bit more room. And we're going to be setting up the scene from scratch. So there's a couple of things you need to know. First, there's the whole aspect of adding the footage inside, but there's also the aspect of lighting the CG to match that footage. So what I did for this is we took 360-degree HDRIs, which is just essentially a 360-degree photo, multiple ones stacked at different exposures, and I'm gonna walk y'all through that process on how to do that. I just want y'all to know in advance, hey, this is how it was done. We had an Insta360 1X, and we took about 5 photos, all at different exposures, from darkest to brightest, so that we could get all of the information around 20 stops of dynamic range, which is usually what you want, because you can your eye can see about 20, and it's really good for lighting the CG scene, because if you don't have enough dynamic range, it's going to be really flat lighting and it's not going to look good at all. Okay guys, so we're inside of Cinema 4D and Octane right here. We got our live viewer window up in the bottom, and we're just going to start by creating a Octane texture. So we're going to create materials, extension C4D Octane material. Cool. So this is going to just stick as a diffuse material, and this is what our footage is going to go on. So we're going to go into the node editor. We're just going to load an image texture. And then we're going to plug that into the diffuse like so. And then we're going to load our image texture from our files. So wherever you exported those files out of DaVinci Resolve, you're going to go ahead and get them and just click the first picture in the sequence. And then once you have that loaded in, it'll pop up like this. And then you're going to go to animation. And this is where it's kind of important not to mess anything up. So movie start frame 0, movie end frame, in my case it was 240, and the movie frame rate 24. Your numbers will probably be different unless you filmed at 24 frames a second also, but this number and this number should be the same. You should start at frame 0 if you exported correctly, and then this movie end frame, this will be just depending on how many frames your footage is when you export it, and you'll see that where it's located. So here we will go from frame 0 and to frame 240, just like that. So we got 240 frames at 24 frames a second. That's more than enough footage to composite over. You can see them all like that. Cool. Along with that, you're going to want to punch Control D and make sure that your Cinema 4D frame rate is set to 24 FPS or whatever your frame rate is as well, because this is where the issues come in, especially if your camera's moving. So you want to make sure we're here at 0, we're at 24 to 240, and then 24 right there. And then we have our timeline here. You can see we can confirm that we're starting at 0 on the timeline. And then we're going to go up to 240, just like that. Whoops, 240. And there we go. We got it all lined up right there. Along with that, just make sure that when you output your, and see right now, I actually didn't change this. You're supposed to be at 24. And then you want to make sure you're matching the dimensions of your original footage. So in my case, we shot this at 4.6K, so that's 4608 by 2592, 24 frames a second from frame 0 to frame 240, just like that. Perfect. Okay, my friends, so before we get started, I just wanted to share all this real quick. This is the 360-degree HDRI, which this isn't actually the HDRI. This is just one of the, I think, 4 photos. So you see we got the exposure as dark as we could. The sun's coming up over there, so that's a little overexposed, but this is the best the camera could do. So we have one photo here, second photo there, and you can see the brightness is slowly increasing. We're not waiting for the sun to rise. What we're doing is we're just manually increasing the brightness on the camera. So I think our shutter was at 1/8,000th, then 1/4,000th, then like 1/1000th, and then you can see. So we went from this dark image, which we're getting all the information up here in the highlights in the sky and everything. And then we're not really getting any data right here. So what we slowly did is increase the exposure, take a couple photos. Now we're getting the data from the shadows, and now we're getting the data from everything, which actually this one is a little bit too blown out. So we might not even need it. Most importantly is we got all of these right here, and we'll probably just use this one also. And there's several different versions of this we did throughout the shoot just to make sure we were always capturing the correct lighting environment. So let's take these into Photoshop and merge them together and get them ready to use as Octane as a HDRI. So now what we're going to do is, now that we have Photoshop open, I just opened this picture up in Photoshop. This is not necessary. You don't need to open them up. I just did it so I could get the correct canvas size matched up. We're going to go to File, Automate, and then we're going to go to Merge to HDRI Pro. And then we're going to browse our files. And I know that it's these right here that I want, so I'm going to click open, and then we're going to attempt to automatically align the source images. Okay, we're going to do that right there. Before we move any further, I actually do want to make sure that this is clear to everyone. You do want to go up here to go to image mode, and you want to make sure you're 32 bits per channel. And then it's going to ask you to do that. So make sure that y'all are in that first before you do all this other stuff. So we're going to go to File, again, Automate, Merge to HDRI Pro, select your HDRIs. So I'm going to go Browse. They're right here. And that 32 bits per channel will make sense when we move further on. Cool. So we got it. We got my friend right here. We could paint him out. I'm not going to. I've already done this process. You want to make sure that your people aren't moving around or anything. But we were like, as you can tell, like the lighting was moving fast. So we were in a hurry to get the shoot where we wanted it. Okay, so once that's done, you got this right here. You want to make sure you're in 32 bits. You can remove ghosts if you want. That sometimes helps, sometimes doesn't. I'll just have it checked. So we were +3 exposure, -2, 0, 4. So we got a good amount of dynamic range. Probably didn't hit the 20 that we wanted, but it will be good enough for this scene, especially since it's not midday. So you can see as we change the exposure, we get all the data. You would not be able to do this with a regular photo. So we're getting all of our stops right there. We're just match it up probably around right there. Punch OK. Okay, so now we have it merged into an HDRI. So we got all of our stops, all our photos are merged together. And you can just confirm this by just dropping an exposure like that. And then as we bring it down and up, you can see we're retaining all of the detail from the highlights and the shadows. And this image is rolling off really differently than what it would be if it was just one photo. Cool. So let's go and take that exposure off. And this is the important part. You're going to want to go to File, and then you're going to go to Save As. And this is where it's going to, you have to do this correctly. If you don't, you will not get the correct amount of information you need for an HDRI. So you're going to go to Save on your computer. And this is where it's really important. You want to do OpenEXR. We love working in OpenEXRs. They can hold 32 bits of channel data. That's exactly what we need. So you're going to save that right there. And then we're going to be inside of Octane and Cinema 4D and importing it in. So just save it to your file, and then we'll move on to the next step. So now we're going to import our HDRI environment. That's actually going to be pretty simple. You're just going to go over here to Options, HDRI Environment. There we go, got it right there. And then just load in your image texture. So I got mine right here, Crash Site 1. I do not want to save the changes. Okay, cool. So now we have it loaded in. And if I snap out of our camera view, and everything's looking good here, you can always change your settings. If something's not correct, you might want to change your power right here, or some different settings around here, just depending on how you did it. But if you're following along with me, everything should check out and be okay. So great, we got our HDRI in the scene, and if we move around, you can see we got our lighting. There's this weird cutoff right here. That was just because it didn't export correctly, but that's fine. So we got all this. Doesn't matter because we're not even going to be facing that direction. So we're going to actually be facing this direction, and I already have the camera set up. So we got our camera set up. We're going to go ahead and delete that cube right there. And we're just going to try to position it kind of in the direction that our CG is going to be. So in this case, the sun was behind us. There we go. It's going to be this direction right here. This is not important. This looks a little crazy. That's because I fixed my friend out of it. That's really not important that this matches completely. Like, it doesn't have to be one-to-one. We're really just using the lighting data, and I'll explain that right here. So what we have here is we have our HDRI, and then we opened up our Octane settings just like this. We're going to click Alpha Channel, and then we don't want to click Keep Environment. And that's because if we go here, we add a plane in, or actually we'll even do better, we'll add a cube in. Cool, so we got our cube in here. I'm just going to create a regular old material. This is just to show y'all, hey, this is how it works. Drop it in right there, drop it on top like that. And then we're going to go over here, and then we're going to go to Metallic. And you notice we are reflecting our environment now on this cube. So if I rotate it, you can see right there, I can even increase the roughness. And now we kind of got that same color of the environment, the reflections, everything that you need. So that was really just the purpose of this, is just to get the same type of lighting and reflections in our CG. Awesome, so we got our alpha channel set up like we need it to be, but now we need to actually import our footage to match the CG to it. So what you're gonna do is just create a background. So just search a background, create that background. And that same image texture we used, we imported earlier, is gonna go on this background. So I'm just gonna go ahead and turn it on just like that. So now we have our background and we have our Octane material on that background. Look, now we can see our whole scene. So you have to remember, this is just a flat plane. So you're gonna actually have to match your perspectives of everything, and I've already done that right here for y'all. Once we have our background in there, we can start moving our parts around just like that, and they'll be right there. And there's one final thing that you do need to do, and that's create a shadow catcher. So if I turn this off and on, you can see what just happened right there. So you can drop your parts in, kind of line them up, but you're really going to want to create a shadow catcher along while doing that. And it's kind of just depends on your workflow and how you want to do it. So what I did is I just created a plane, and then I matched the plane up with the ground, and then I created this material. So I'll show you this material. So get your plane matched up like this with your ground. And this is where your shadow is going to be. You can see we're catching shadows right there. So we're going to create materials, extension, C40 Octane, Octane material. And then we're going to drag that on to our plane, which is right here. Cool. Nothing happened. So we actually have to specify that this is a shadow catcher. And shadow catchers are used in CG all the time. So we're going to go to common right here. Check shadow catcher. There you go. So now we're catching the shadows. You can see right here we got a little bit of shadows going on. This is not direct lighting. This is more of an overcast lighting. So it's not as dramatic, but it still makes a big difference. So now that I have my shadow catcher on, I'm catching the shadows from the environment around, and I'm just going to move these kind of pieces, try to match up the perspective, and you see like I'm cutting stuff off right here. You see these rocks. Let's make this bigger so that y'all can tell. It's kind of like on top of this rock right here, and it's not really looking correct. That's okay, because we're going to be going in, and you can actually rotoscope that out to match better. And then also it's not blending with the ground perfectly. That can also be done. See, I was just sitting on that rock right there. These are just things you would rotoscope out later on. If you don't want to rotoscope anything out, you kind of have to place it in a spot that looks all right. So somewhere like that. And like that. And I also, just to be clear, I just created these materials for the ship. This is kind of a bronzy material. We already went over creating materials, so just create your own material depending on what you're doing, what you need. So it is okay to place stuff over other things. Just know you'll have to rotoscope it out later. So just set up a composition, and once you kind of get your composition where you like it, which let's just say this is good for now. Right there, and you can see Octane's jumping around a lot. It's because that's a load in all these image textures. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to your background and turn that off. So now we only have our CG objects and the shadow, and that's all we want. We don't want the Octane sky. You want to make sure that you're, like I said earlier, you want to make sure, let's go back over here, that you're make sure your alpha channel is on and you have keep environment off, and that's really important. And then I like to do path tracing because that's the most photorealistic besides PMC, but we talked about that already. Path tracing will be perfectly fine enough for this. We're going to go all frames right here. Make sure you're on Octane render. All frames. We got our resolution. Got it all set up. So just a warning in advance. The way I did this was I actually rendered all these parts out separately because I didn't know what I wanted and didn't want. So what I would do is just turn them off like that, and render it out. So this is something that's a little bit special too, because the camera's not moving and we have no kind of like dynamic. I didn't want to put kind of like any dynamic lights or anything on it. I'm going to do all that in post. We can just straight up render this out as one frame and import it as an image in After Effects and just stretch it out over all the frames. So it just depends on what you're doing. If your camera's moving and everything, well, obviously you need to render it out as a image sequence. But if not, you can just render out one EXR. And this is something really important. You want to make sure that you're doing an EXR. So we're going to do opening EXR 32 bits, 16 bits would have been fine. You can also do multi-passes. So I want to show how to set that up as well, because this is pretty important for compositing and kind of just matching everything up. You might be using your multi-passes. So we're going to go over here to our settings, go to Octane Render, and go to Render Passes right here. You want to enable them. Choose a file. We're going to do EXRs 16 bits per channel, linear, make sure that you're in linear mode, and then you can choose what you want. So we have shadows, reflections, diffuse. I don't really think there's anything. Z depth, volume, post-processing. And then as we check these right here, you can see we have the different ones. So here's our reflection channel, here's our shadows, here's our volume, which we don't have any, here's our volume Z, here's our post. These are all things that you'll be using inside to composite with. However, for this particular tutorial, I actually have already done this and I've figured out I really didn't need to use these. You might need to, so you can use them if you want. They're there for you. They're tools to use. You definitely don't need to use all of these. Very rarely do I even use. If I am going to use some, I will say the most helpful ones are the shadows and the reflections and the diffuse and the main. And that's really, if I'm going to go all out, I use those. But really most of the time, realistically, I don't need to, because I can get around it with color compositing. So we're just going to export that. If you want to export them all, you can. I am just going to be using the main one. So under my settings, I'm not going to save the multipass. And we're going to render them all out. And I'll meet you inside of After Effects. Okay, so we're inside After Effects, and you can see we have the project set up and everything already, but I want to walk you through how to create something like this. So there's several elements going on here. We have our CG elements right here. We have our fire elements right here, which are not done inside of After Effects. These are actually just stock footage elements. We have this crazy glow going on, so I'm actually going to turn it all off. See, the biggest problem with this scene was, as you know before, we added the fire and everything. Let me just turn it off. There's no light. There's no lighting or anything going on. I also have these lens artifacts, and we'll go over all that. But the biggest problem, guys, is hey, there's no lighting. Like there should be light, and this is actually real fire, so you can see there's a little bit of a glow. But if you have a big fire like this back here, you should have a lot of light, and that is actually on a separate layer. So how did I get around that? Well, I got around it by creating these solids just like this and adding them in like that. So we'll just do it real quick just to show y'all. Go ahead and import your footage, and just so we're not jumping ahead of anything, import your footage. Got it. And this can be your raw footage. This can be your footage you export out of DaVinci Resolve. Just make sure the frames line up, because if they don't and your camera's moving, you have big issues. Import your footage, then import your CG objects like that. And mine are all in separate layers because I have fire in between them, and if I exported them all in the same layer, that wouldn't have worked. So that's another reason I did it differently. Along with that, we might as well go over it. I'm going to go ahead and turn all of these off except for the front one. And I'm going to go over what's going on here, because it looks pretty good. It matches up right now, especially if I turn the fire on and all the other effects. But we're going to zoom in right here. So you see all this. This is called, like, this different color difference. That's called chromatic aberration. So if we exported our raw, let me go ahead. This is what our raw looks like. This is straight out of render. Not too good, to be honest. It looks pretty horrible. So what do we do here? So first things first, I blurred it. CG always comes out too sharp. So you can see with the blur, it matches a lot better. Turn it off, turn it on. There you go. And we are at a quarter resolution right here. Let me go up to full so you see the full impact. It's just going to take a lot longer to load. There we go. So turn it off, turn it on. There you go. So it's matching a little bit better. Then I did a Lumetri color, and this is the Lumetri color. Unfortunately, it's not loading them in. So we're just going to refresh it real quick. Turn on and off. There we go. So the Lumetri color, you can see what it did. I really just, honestly guys, you just got to look at your footage. So we'll go over here, and there's really no tricks or anything. This is just something you're going to have to play around with. We're going to go to our window and make sure that our scopes are up right here. This is kind of how I help do it myself. What I'll do is I'll turn the CG footage on and off, and I'll see what it's doing. Okay, so where it's sitting. And then I'll just adjust it based off that. I also look at this footage. I mean, looking here, there's a lot of blue and kind of a pinkish purple color in everything. We look at the ground, you can see it everywhere. So I kind of push that in there with the Lumetri color, just like that. So we went from there to there, there to there. And you can see our Vetroscope is more pulled out like that as well. Then I added the curves. Not doing much there. I really, this is kind of something cool that I did, which I'll go ahead and explain. This is very specific to this project, but you could do it as well. And I added this bump in the curve. And then I did a wiggle expression, which let's see if I can find that. It's going to be somewhere here. There's a wiggle expression on this curve, and it's going to wiggle on and off. And it's just going to essentially, let me see if I can get it to preview. And it's going really slow, but it's going to give us a kind of a flicker effect. So you can see it right there starting to flicker. And if you go back and watch the main footage, you'll see it flickering. That's just the fire. And this is just happening to the highlights right here. So if you want to, you can just program a wiggle expression. It's really simple to do. Let's just go to something random. Let's go to, let's do it in blur. Just punch control the blurriness. Let's say for some reason you wanted your blur to blur in and out. You just type in wiggle. And then you do a number, so like 15, 15. So those two are kind of going to affect how frequent and then how much. So the first number is frequency. How frequent is it going to be going on and off? And then the second number is how much. So like if you're going to do 15 by 15, it's going to be blurring in and out. 15 frequency times 15 in value. This is something you're just going to go and find out by yourself. For me, the numbers were like, I believe 50 and 150. It really depends on your scene though and what's going on. So once we add the CG footage in right there, I just added the rest. You can see right here and right here, these two are in the back and they're quite a bit more blurry. That's simply because they're a little bit more out of the focal plane. And then as well with that, I did kind of do the same stuff, but I slightly changed their colors and stuff because they weren't fitting well. This is something you're just gonna have to do by eye and just figure it out, try to find where it goes. Now, this doesn't look too great, obviously. It looks pretty fake. That's fine because I knew we were going to be adding in fire, and I knew that would hide a lot more of the CG fakeness. There's a lot of problems with this scene, and one of them is the time of day we shot it, we were expecting a sunrise. However, it was cloudy, so we did not get that direct light we were looking for. We got this soft light, and soft light is really hard to work with CG. So immediately, as soon as I knew we were getting this soft light for that day, I was like, okay, change the plan. We're going to restructure this whole scene, and then we're going to add in a bunch of fire in post. So luckily we already had this little bit of fire in here for me to reference, but what I did is I just created these solids. So just new solid like that, and then I made an orange color like this, and then what you want to do is grab your pen tool like this, just do something like that. Let's say the fire is coming from this side of the screen. Cool. And then punch feather, punch F, and that'll feather the mask. There you go. Go to blending mode. We can try add, and then there's another one that I like to use, and that's screen. Pick whichever one you think works best for your scene. I think I did add on these. Yep. And then you're gonna punch T, and that's your opacity, and just take that down, and now you get a little glow in your scene. And realistically, what I would do is punch the F for feather and just feather it out a little bit more because it's going to kind of bloom across the screen. And you can see we're already adding in this light source. It's going to take some time to balance it out correctly, but I ended up creating 3 of these. So here they are like that. And I knew the fire is going to be coming from here, and there's going to be some back here. So it's going to bloom out the screen, and we're going to get that light over it. The fire. Let's talk about that real quick. This has nothing to do with Cinema 4D or Octane, but I still wanted to talk about this. So this is our fire, And yeah, it's pretty intense. We have a lot of it. We have a bunch of stock footage. A lot of these are repeated over and over. So I think there's like totally 5 clips, but I just repeated them. The basics of what's going on here. Let's just target a group. Okay, we'll target that group right there. So I'm going to turn everything else off. Turn that off and turn that off. And just so you can see how what's going on here. Because these principles will carry over to any other CG stock footage as well. So we got our fire, and let's just work our way up from the bottom. So we have some smoke in the back. Then we have some fire. Then we have some more smoke. Then we have some fire. And we have some more fire. We're really just stacking all these elements on top of each other and creating this big, crazy mess until we have something like that. And then what I did is I took that structure of mixing the smoke and fire and matching it to the ground. So if we go back to our track test right here, or my bad, if we go back to our pre-comp, which is right here, it's going to load it all in. But there it goes. Let's turn that fire on. You can see now we have our fire in there, and it's looking pretty good. It's behind the CG objects, so we're hiding a little bit. And we just kind of, by just transforming each one individually, match to the ground. So what I mean by that is I go in here, I go to the fire, I punch T, or sorry, I think I punch P, yeah, it's position, and then just kind of position it. And along with all of that going on, I also did kind of mask out each individual fire, because you can see how it kind of cuts off randomly. It just depends on your scene and what kind of stock footage you're working with. The stock footage I'm working with, I think, is from Action Essentials. So that's Film Rights pack, and it was a little bit messy, but I was able to clean it up, and it's definitely good quality stock footage. I 100% recommend it. It's just going to require a little bit of finessing. So we do all that. We copy and paste over and over, get our scene set up, and this does really slow down After Effects. The render time, export time, whatever you want to call it, on this scene was over 12 hours at 4K, which is kind of ridiculous, but it is what it is. It's how it is in After Effects. So especially when you're working with all that footage. Awesome. Let me go back to our project right here. And you can see I have several pre-comps here. Each pre-comp is doing something different. Because we're not working in nodes, which is unfortunate, we're having to do a lot of pre-comps. So we have our fire pre-comp. Then we have our pre-comp 1. This is with everything in it. So our fire and our spaceships. You can see how that's mixed together. Also, I did another pro tip. If you're going to have elements creating light, I actually just grabbed these lens dirt add-ons and I kind of flickered their color. Not their color, but their intensity, their exposure right there. So you can see that number kind of flickering back and forth, and it's just going to create a slight flicker. That's because the fire's flickering, and it's more realistic if you have kind of like a lens element matching that. And then I'm just going to turn these all back on. And as I turn them on, you can kind of see everything that's going on, just like that. So we got it all in. We got it all matched up. Everything's looking great and fine. Actually, that looks a little off. I'm not sure what happened there. But still, we have more effects on our pre-comp. So this is what the fire looked like coming straight out of the fire layer. Is first off, it's way too sharp, and it doesn't feel like it's in the footage, especially if I turn these elements off. It just doesn't feel like it's fitting in. So what I did is I added a deep glow and then a Gaussian blur because I felt like it was too sharp. I added some grain, and then I blurred the channels. And this is a plugin. This is really just adding chromatic aberration to it. So just add chromatic aberration to your footage, and you should be fine, just like that. And then especially when we mix it with this, it's looking pretty good. One thing I do want to mention is that when you import your CGI footage and you drop it in, sometimes you can get these weird white ghost lines around it. So that's easily solved. You just go here, and then you go to interpret footage. You make sure you're in your project and click interpret footage. So we're going to click that and go to main. So we have our main pulled up. You can punch guess. See, there's different types of interpreting the alpha because we exported with the alpha. So if we do pre-multiplied and we punch OK, we should be getting some white ghost lines, which I'm not sure if they're going to pop up. But you'll probably be getting those, and that's just because After Effects is not interpreting the footage properly. So just go right here, and I just like to punch guess because usually it's straight unmatted, and that's what it should be. Depending on how you export it and what settings you're using, it might be something different. It's good just to punch guess. Usually After Effects is correct, and you won't get that line around your CG footage, which is so annoying, and it gives it right away as being fake. Oh yeah, and then I also added some more fire in, and that was just to put behind there. And then we go over to our clip one final. Okay, so this is interesting. This is kind of our here, and we're right there. So we're in our clip one final, and what I did here is nothing too crazy. I used a Video Copilot's optical flares plugin, and I created this one. I think I took it from a preset, but just modified it slightly. And I just added some lens distortions and whatnot on top of it. The more, guys, the more mistakes you can add to your footage, the better it's going to be, especially when you're working on a quick deadline and you don't have time to completely perfect your CG like you want it to be. Because I could have spent days texturing this, but I was like, I don't have, for this particular project, I didn't have the time or the resources to do that. So what I did instead was, okay, I'm going to fix it in compositing, which is not the best thing to do, but it is it's definitely an option out there. And what I did here is I just I used the tracker and I tracked our footage. And the reason I'm tracking to our footage is because over our footage right here, I added a wiggle expression to the position of it. So you can see in the main, it's going to take too long to load here, which it gets really frustrating working with the CG footage. It gets too long here, or it gets too slow here to load. But there's a wiggle expression under the transform of our footage. So that's actually that's in another pre-comp, which is the track test pre-comp. So many pre-comps. This is why it's so great to work in nodes. But this project, I didn't have time to set all that up. So I zoomed in, and then I added a wiggle expression to the position, and you can see that right here. Wiggle 4.4, 120. And then that's just going to shake our footage around. It's going to make it feel more dynamic and more real. This is not an actual perspective change of the camera, so you have to keep that in mind. It's not going to look as good as if we were actually shaking the camera and moving it around, but it definitely saved time for me tracking and trying to match this 2D footage up to that perspective correctly. So this was a little cheat that we did. Along with that, I did also just brighten the middle because I felt like the middle wasn't bright enough, so I added a little brightness there, and then I added a slight vignette with this black solid. And now we can go to our final. Cool. So we got our footage shaking and everything, but now what I wanted to do is add the final little touches. So I wanted to add this little lens flare right here, and you can see it if you watch the intro. It kind of moves around with the footage. This is because I track the footage. So to track footage, it's pretty simple. We want to make sure that this clip that we wiggled has been pre-composed. Then you're going to go to tracker, and then just click track motion, and then you're going to find a point that you want to track. I turned off all of these effects. Everything was off. So I went back, turned off all the effects just so it was easier to track. And then you're just going to track forward. Once you have it tracked forward, you want to apply it to XY dimensions to a null. So you apply it to your null, which is right here. Once you have it applied to your null, you're going to want to create just a After Effects light. And then what you're going to do is go in, if you have this plugin, you can do this. If not, you can just throw on some footage of, you could even film it yourself of just like a light shining in a camera. And it's going to give you some like lens, kind of lens flares and stuff to match up. And if you don't have any, if you're not adding any light in like I am, you don't have to do this. This is just for this specific project. I kind of wanted to break everything down. And then we add our optical flares in, and then the positioning mode you want to do to track to lights. So we did that because we linked our light to our null with the position pick whip, just like there you go. And then what we're going to do is we linked our light to our null, so our light is now moving with the track that we did. Then we went here and we went, we're just going to go over here and disable 3D. These will all be checked, and this is not what you want. So you want all those unchecked like that, and then just click tracked lights, and then you got a lens flare moving around with your footage. Cool. It's a lot of work for something small, but I felt like it was necessary to make up for this CG, which didn't feel completely realistic at the time. So then you would export, and I'll give y'all some tips on exporting. There's something, I turned on an element that I don't like, this smoke, but it doesn't matter because I've already exported this and finished this project. So let's say, hey, you got your CG and everything, it's perfect. You matched it up, everything looking great. Cool. So now we're going to go to File, Export, add it to Adobe Media Encoder Q. So the reason we're using the Adobe Media Encoder Q is because it is, in my experience, way more stable and way faster than the After Effects Render Q. That's really the only reasons. So right now we have a QuickTime in STC DV 24p, whatever. We don't want that. So this has not been colored yet. We just matched all the CG up together essentially. What I would do, like I said in the beginning, is I would separate your CG and your footage. So I turn your footage off, export it, just the CG, and then just export your footage or just grab your raw footage. And then when you send it to be colored by colorist, or if you're coloring yourself like me, so you have a little bit more freedom. You can also export them together if they prefer it that way, but I'm just saying usually I like to separate them and color them and kind of match them together. So let's get this set up to be colored, because this codec right now is horrible for coloring, which essentially just means there's not enough data there. So we want to get the most amount of data out of our CG footage and out of our other footage as possible so that we can fully take advantage of all the information that's there. So what we're going to do is go to QuickTime, and then what we want to do is go to Apple ProRes 444. There we go. And now you can see it's going to re-render or create a preview. And this is huge. Render at maximum depth, 16 bits. And then there's different recs. I'm going to use a Rec 709, but there's Rec 2100 HLG and 2100 BQ. These are different color spaces. I'm going to be working in the 709 color space for this. You might be working in ACES or something else. If you are, that's awesome. But for this, it's not necessary. So here we are. We're in the rec color space. We're 16 bits per channel, 709, perfect. And then use maximum render quality, and then it's ready to export just like that. So you're gonna punch OK, and then you're gonna punch play. It's really important. I like to use Apple ProRes 444 because it has the in my experience, it has the best quality to size ratio. So the files aren't crazy huge. They're easier to read and edit. They're easier to work with color-wise. So that's why I use that. You can use your favorite codec. And that is the full explanation on how to do a CGI composited kind of the full workflow. How I take stuff into After Effects and put it into, or how I take footage, take it in Cinema 4D, put it into After Effects, and then export it to be colored. Thank you guys for watching, and please DM me on Instagram if you want to know anything else about this whole process. I could do a 3D one with the camera moving and stuff if y'all really want that. I have no problem making that. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next lesson.